Good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 4 for PPA 500. I know it's kind of, at least for me, it's a little surprising. We're already in week 4 out of 6. It just seems like the courses go by very quickly. But again, you'll get the feel for it. The more courses you take in the program, the more comfortable you will get with these 6-week types of formats. But this is week number 4, and I just want to alert you that tonight we're going to do a little bit of an abbreviated session this evening because I am scheduled to fly off to DC tonight. My flight got moved up, so it's leaving earlier than I had anticipated. So I think we're probably going to do from about 6 o'clock to 7:30 this evening, and then as soon as we're done at 7:30, I'm going to race off to the airport and hopefully try and catch my flight in time. And I'll be in DC until Sunday evening, or kind of, I guess it's late Sunday night. And then next week, I'm traveling again, in that on Wednesday next week, I am headed to Northern California to chair an accreditation site visit for another Cal State up in Northern California. So that one I'm leaving for on Wednesday, but I have worked the schedule out with the program that's hosting us so that we'll still be able to have class next Wednesday. I'll just be doing it from Northern California instead of from here. But just to be safe, because for that accreditation site visit, I have a meeting at 5 o'clock next Wednesday. I don't want to cut it too close and not be able to get back to the hotel and get logged in time to start the class at 6. So I think for next week, we'll probably push our start time to 7 o'clock instead of 6 o'clock. And then we'll have plenty of time from 7 to 9:30 to cover all the information that we need to cover next week. So just a quick recap. Tonight, we're going to go until about 7:30. Will give us plenty of time to cover the information we want to cover tonight, these theoretical approaches in the field of public administration. Then next week, we'll start up at 7 o'clock next Wednesday. And next week, we will start covering the functions of public administration and the functions and roles played by public administrators. And next week, we'll start with a discussion of the roles of public administrators in the public policy process. Then we'll talk about the roles of public administrators in program implementation and program evaluation. We'll also then talk about how we in public administration measure the term effectiveness, because most of the theories that we are going to talk about tonight, they are all oriented around the idea of trying to make our organizations and our policies and our public programs as effective as they can possibly be. And so we'll have a discussion next week about what we mean by this term effectiveness. Then in our final Wednesday night session together, 2 weeks from tonight, we will then get into a discussion of another function of public administration, which is the management of human resources. We'll do that in the first half of class 2 weeks from tonight. Then we'll talk about the management of fiscal resources as another important function of public administration. The way in which it's looking, I believe we're probably going to be able to finish all of our material in that last Wednesday session. But if for some reason we cannot finish all the material in that last Wednesday session, then we can always finish it up then on that Saturday, March 9th, I believe the date is. So we'll have plenty of time in order to cover everything we always cover here in the PPA 500 course. So those are the slight little changes in our schedule. I'll send everyone an email reminder sometime early next week about the start time at 7 o'clock for next week's class, just so everyone remembers that. A couple little reminders. Number one, your midterm assessment. Remember, that is due by midnight on Monday, February 26th. And then Canvas essay number 3, and I know several people have already submitted their initial posts for that. That is then due next Monday as well, February 26th by midnight. So those are the 2 assignments you have coming up due next Monday. Now, I know it's a little early, or may feel strange that you're still working on the midterm assessment. So it's a little strange to talk about the final assessment, but because we are a 6-week course, we kind of have to recognize that the final assessment is kind of around the corner. And so what I will do is when I return back to town on Sunday, I will then make the final assessment available on our Canvas site. And then in our class session next week, when we start our session, we'll talk through the final assessment, just like we did with the midterm assessment, to make sure everyone is comfortable with the scenarios and the questions that are being asked. So That final assessment should then be available to you on Canvas no later than next Monday. I just kind of hate to make it available while you're still working on the midterm assessment. It's kind of a little depressing to see a final assessment pop up while you're still working on the midterm assessment. But again, it's kind of the nature of the beast with these 6-week courses. But what I have planned for us tonight, and again, I think we can certainly wrap this up in about an hour and a half, is a discussion of the theoretical perspectives in the field of public administration. And I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. Oops. Just to make sure I can save on a little bit of bandwidth. Okay. So last week we talked about this whole idea of public administration as an academic discipline. And we were asking the question, is it an academic discipline or just a subfield in public administration? And you'll return to that question in Canvas essay number 4, which is, right around the corner as well. But what we talked about, as we said, academic disciplines typically demonstrate certain characteristics. So in an academic discipline, you are studying unique phenomena. So you're studying phenomena that is relatively unique to that field of study, unique enough to separate that phenomena from other fields of study. So we study unique phenomena. Secondly, we apply relatively unique methods and approaches to study that unique phenomena. So the methods that you use in academic discipline are going to be somewhat different than the methods used in other academic disciplines. And I think we point out the difference between political science and history, and how in political science we tend to be much more quantitative. That's the science part of political science. Whereas in history, we tend to be much more qualitative and do approaches such as thematic content analysis. So we apply unique methods to study those unique phenomena. And then the data that we collect from those unique methods, we then use that data to generate unique theories and models. Theories and models about how the different phenomena relate with each other and interact with each other in our field of study. And I think we had also mentioned the difference between theories and models. Theories are relatively abstract in that they postulate relationships between abstract constructs, things that are a little bit difficult for us to actually measure. So in order to measure those concepts, we then have to develop variables, and our models are then more specific theories that will then postulate relationships between our variables. And our variables are then more specific and more measurable indicators of those abstract concepts. So in an academic discipline, we develop theories and we develop models to explain the phenomena that we study within that academic discipline. So the information we're covering here tonight, we're going to look at the development of those theoretical perspectives in the field of public administration. And this will all go toward helping you answer that question of, is public administration an academic discipline or a subfield in another academic discipline? And again, you'll be doing that then in Canvas essay number 4. And there is no right or wrong answer to that. Some people feel it is its own academic discipline. Some feel that's a subfield. As long as you justify your answer, that's all you really need to do in terms of Canvas essay number 4. But some of the information we cover here tonight will certainly help with that. Also, the information we cover here tonight in the development of the theoretical approaches, that information will always also be highly useful for you on the midterm assessment in terms of answering scenario number 5. And in scenario number 5 in the midterm assessment, I ask you, based upon this scenario, which 2 classical authors or theories would you recommend applying? And then which 2 neoclassical theories or authors would you recommend applying? And so tonight we're going to go through the classical school and we'll go through neoclassical schools as well. So at the conclusion of our discussion tonight, you'll have all the information you then need to do a good job on scenario 5 on the midterm assessment. Now, admittedly, discussing the theoretical perspectives in public administration and the evolution of those perspectives can be a kind of a daunting task, especially when you're doing it in a course such as this, because this is an introductory, survey-oriented type of course. So there are only so many schools of thought we can cover, only so many theorists within those schools that we can talk about. So, admittedly, what we're going to talk about tonight will just kind of be the tip of the iceberg in terms of the theoretical perspectives in the field of public administration. But what tonight's discussion will do is it will then help prepare you for moving ahead and taking PPA 660, Organization Theory and Development, which you will have the misfortune of having me as the instructor for that course. But we will really delve a lot deeper into a lot of these schools of thought and a lot of these theories once we get to 660. So this is just kind of a primer, kind of a foreshadowing of some of the things we'll talk about in 660. So the way in which I'd like to handle this is I always think it's useful to do it in a chronological type of method. And so we are going to follow the evolution of the theory development in public administration from the late 1800s until modern times. And so we're going to do it very much chronologically. And the benefit of doing it chronologically is, like we had talked about last week, public administration is timeless, but it is also time bound. As we talked about last week, these theories are really very much products of their time. And so when we talk about scientific management, we'll see how that theory was a product of its time. When we talk about human relations theory, we'll see how that was a product of the 1940s and the 1950s. Systems theory, we'll see how that was a product of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. So it's really good for us to kind of follow that chronological development from the late 1800s up until modern times. So where we usually start our coverage of public administration theories is back in the late 1800s with the school that we refer to as the classical school. And admittedly, if you had an undergraduate minor in public administration or you took undergraduate public administration courses, probably a lot of these theorists are going to be very familiar to you. But the goal here is to kind of create that common playing field for everyone, irrespective of what undergraduate major you have. So the classical school, we're talking about late 1800s, running up through like the 1930s or so. And in this classical school, there are three main authors that we are going to talk about in this class tonight. The three classical authors we'll talk about are Max Weber, and you had an article in the classics textbook by Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and that's the gentleman in the center of your screen, and Luther Gulick, who is a gentleman with the very impressive facial hair at the bottom right of your screen. So those are the three classical authors that we will talk about. So let's start with Max Weber. Now, if you're familiar at all with Max Weber, you know that Max Weber's training was in the world of law, and he was very much had legal training. That was the basis of his education. And I should mention, as we go through all these different schools of thought and these different theories, I want you to keep your eye on three different things. The first thing I want you to keep your eye on are the similarities between these different schools of thought and these different theories. So think about what's the connective tissue? What is that thread that ties all these different theories in a school of thought together? So look out for those similarities. Then secondly, look out for the differences. So what are some of the differences and distinctions between these different theories and these different schools of thought? Because obviously, whenever a new school of thought is developed, that new school of thought is usually developed as a response to what are considered some of the weaknesses or some of the failures in the previous school of thought. So a lot of our neoclassical schools were developed as responses or rejoinders to the weaknesses identified in the classical school. So take a look at some of those differences. And then number three, I'd like you to pay attention to where these theories come from. Are these homegrown theories that were generated within the field of public administration? Or are these theories that we borrow from other fields such as business or psychology or sociology, and then brought those theories into public administration, modified them in order to make them fit our public organizations? So kind of look at, are they homegrown or are they from other disciplines that we are borrowing? And that then again gets at this idea of an academic discipline develops its own unique theories. So the first person we start with is Max Weber. As I said, he comes from a very legal background. Max Weber really felt that bureaucratic organizations were the highest level of rationality. And he believed that when we make our decisions, we should not base our decisions on how we feel or what we believe, but rather we should base our decisions upon the empirical evidence that we are collecting and that we are analyzing. And we're going to use that term empirical, not just tonight, but we're also going to use it next week as well. When we're talking about empirical, empirical can be quantitative, numbers based. It can also be qualitative, words based, because the difference between qualitative and quantitative is just how you're communicating. Are you communicating with numbers? Or are you communicating with words and phrases? So it can be both qualitative as well as quantitative. But what makes information empirical is that it is tangible. It is information that we are able to identify, collect, and analyze. Now, admittedly, the way we analyze qualitative and quantitative information may be different, but empirical information is information that's tangible, that we can collect, and we can analyze. So Max Weber really believed in the collection of information and making decisions based upon that type of empirical evidence. Weber's focus, his ultimate goal, was to try and make the organization as efficient and effective as possible. So his goal was a very macro level goal. Now he was looking at the organization's benefits and the organization's well-being as opposed to the well-being of individual employees within that organization. So his goal was organizational effectiveness and efficiency. Weber felt that the best way to achieve that effectiveness and efficiency is through the creation of this ideal bureaucratic organization. So Weber focused on organization structure. He said if we could structure our organization in this ideal way, then that ideal bureaucratic organization will then be effective at achieving its goals and its objectives. So Weber gives us this ideal bureaucratic structure. And he says an ideal bureaucracy, an ideal organization is one that has a tall hierarchy. That tall hierarchy, as we had mentioned in a previous class, is that pyramidal shape that you have to your organization structure, where you'll probably have a singular head for that organization. Then as you move down the organization structure, you encounter more and more positions, whereas the plurality of the position, most of your positions, will congregate at the lower end of that pyramid. In a tall hierarchy, most of the decision making is centralized. Most of that decision making then flows down. Those decisions are made at the upper level, and then those orders then flow down through the organization. So it's a very top down type of relationship. In these tall hierarchies, we also divide up the work. So division of labor is a second principle. We have all this work to do as an organization. So in order to get it all done, one person doesn't do everything, but everyone takes a little piece of that work and works on a little piece of those tasks. When you divide up the work, you divide up the labor, you are specializing in task. So some people specialize in certain tasks, some people specialize in other tasks. So for instance, you have budget analysts, they specialize in budget analysis. You'll have project managers who will specialize in managing a certain type of project. You'll have HR managers who will focus on management of human resources. You'll have grant coordinators, and they will focus on writing those grants and trying to get those grants funded. So everyone specializes in a different set of tasks. The good thing about specialization of tasks is that it then creates experts. So if you're doing the same job day in and day out, you are going to become the expert on how to do that job. So specialization of tasks allows our organization to then be staffed by experts. These are experts who then have the ability to know what data to collect, how to analyze that data, and then how to use that data in order to recommend decisions to upper level management. In this tall hierarchical system, we have what's called unity of command. Sometimes unity of command is referred to as a scalar chain. And in a scalar chain and unity of command, everyone knows to whom they are responsible. So you know who your supervisor is. Your supervisor knows who their supervisor is, and so on and so on up the organizational chain. So everyone knows to whom they are accountable. We also have what's called span of control. Span of control means that supervisors are only responsible for a limited number of employees below them in the organizational structure. So you won't have a supervisor who is then responsible for everyone in the organization. They will be responsible for a limited number of people. So maybe they'll be responsible for a unit that has 10 employees or a unit that has 15 employees, but they will have a limitation in terms of who they are held responsible for. These employees who are experts are also professionals and they're also career employees. So they are professionals and they are in these organizations for a career. We had talked about this before when we talked about accountability and ethics. We said the one profession that we all share is the profession of public administration. However, many of us have other professions such as engineering or fiscal management, and so we also are accountable for those other professions as well. But these people who are working in these organizations, they are professionals, which means they have expectations for their behavior, they have norms, they have values that they have to adhere to, and they also view their time in this organization as permanent. They are there for a career for 20 or 30 or 40 years. So there's not a whole lot of free agency where people just bounce back and forth between different agencies. You are in that organization for a career. And then what that organization does and how it makes its decisions will all be based upon written documentation. So we'll have written rules and regulations, written policies and procedures. We'll write all of this down. Basing your actions on written documentation, the advantage of that is that it allows you to treat people equally. So here are the rules. Everyone is going to be held accountable for these rules and regulations. That's the upside. You can protect individual rights and you can protect equal treatment. The downside, obviously, is when you have too many rules and regulations, then you end up with the dreaded red tape. And sometimes there is a bureaucratic dysfunction that occurs in older organizations known as goal displacement. And in goal displacement, what will happen is as an organization ages, that organization will develop more rules and more policies and procedures. And all these rules and policies and procedures will then be written down. When you get all these rules and regulations written down, sometimes the goal of the organization becomes adhering to those rules as opposed to serving the needs of citizens. The ultimate goal of an organization, according to people like Robert Merton, is to serve citizens, to deliver effective goods and services and programs that will meet the needs of those citizens. However, when your goal becomes just adhering to rules and regulations, you have now suffered goal displacement. Goal displacement, as Merton says, is one of the primary bureaucratic dysfunctions that we typically see in older organizations. As organizations age, they become more institutionally rigid. And as they become more institutionally rigid and suffer from institutional rigidity, they then start to build walls between the organization and citizens that they are trying to serve. That then, as we had mentioned last week, will create a lot of distrust among the public, and the public will then become disaffected with these bureaucratic organizations. And that's one of the primary reasons why, when you say bureaucracy to a member of the public, you oftentimes hear an association with words such as impersonal or unmoving or slow, gridlock. Those are the types of negative associations that people tend to have with bureaucracies, especially when they become too overly rigid. So to recap, Max Weber from the legal world, writing in the late 1800s, is kind of this grandfather, if you will, of the classical school of organization theory. He focused on the goals of the organization and felt that you can make the organization more effective and efficient through structuring your organization according to these principles in his ideal bureaucracy. Then a second classical author is Frederick Taylor. Now, Frederick Taylor comes to us from the world of business. And so Frederick Taylor developed many of his theories, pretty much all of his theories, for the private sector, developed them for the private sector, implemented them in private corporations, and then the public sector then took note of some of the efficiencies that these private corporations were experiencing. And then the public sector borrowed these theories and started applying them to public organizations. Frederick Taylor is best known for his theory scientific management. When you think about when Frederick Taylor was writing, and that's in the early 1900s, the 19 teens, and the 1920s, we had a lot of unrest in a lot of our factories. And those factories were very dehumanizing types of places to be. And you had employees who were just engaging in what Taylor called soldiering. And soldiering, according to Taylor, was just doing just enough to get by. So they weren't working hard, they weren't trying to be productive, they were just doing enough to not get fired from their factory jobs. So, what Taylor wanted to do is he wanted to develop a scientific theory in which we could identify the one best way to do a job and then teach our employees how to do that job in that one best way, monitor their performance. And for those employees who were doing the job the way they were trained in that one best way, we provide them with bonus pay. We give them pay for performance. For those employees who are not doing the job the way in which they were trained, not in that one best way, we fire those employees. We remove them from the organization. Taylor's view of individual employees was a very negative view. And there are some passages from his writing where he refers to employees as being boorish beasts. They are lazy, they're unmotivated, they're not terribly intelligent. You need to teach them how to do the job and then closely monitor them to make sure they're doing it the way they're supposed to. Taylor's scientific management theory really created for us a new level in our organizations known as middle managers. Before Taylor was writing, before his scientific management theory, a lot of organizations kind of had this void in the middle of the organizational chart where you had a lot of people working in bottom level positions and then you had top level leaders, but you didn't have a whole lot of middle managers. Taylor introduces the idea of middle managers, and the job of these middle managers is then to monitor the performance of employees to make sure they're doing the job in that one best way. The mechanism that Taylor used to identify the one best way to do the job were these time motion studies. So in a time motion study, literally what he would do is he would have a performance expert or a performance manager with a stopwatch who would stand behind an employee as that employee did their job. That performance expert would then time every single movement that that employee took, the goal being to identify all the efficient movements and collect all those efficient movements into the one best way to do the job. And then all those inefficient or what he called false movements, you would eliminate. So the one best way to do the job would be the compilation of all these efficient movements that contribute to productivity. So the one of the basic examples of a job that he used was the shoveling of pig ore. So you position yourself behind someone who is shoveling pig ore. You would time the amount of time it took them to pick the shovel up, the amount of time it took them to put the shovel into the pile of pig ore, the amount of time it took them to pick up a shovel full of pig ore, the amount of time it took them to take that pig ore over to a cart, the amount of time it took them to dump the pig ore into that cart, and then the amount of time it took them to return to the original pile and start over again. We time all of those motions, all those movements, and then try and find the most efficient way of shoveling pig ore. And that would then become the one best way to do the job. Once you've identified the one best way to do the job, then when you go out there and hire employees to do this job, you hire employees who have the skill set in order to do the job in that one best way. You then bring them in the organization and you train them how to do the job in that one best way. You then monitor their performance. And those who are performing well, as we said, will get compensation, will get pay for performance. Those who are not performing well are essentially broken cogs in the machinery of the organization. So, like you would do with any other cog in a machine, if a cog is broken, you take it out, you throw it away, you replace it with another cog. So these employees were just replaceable cogs within the machinery of the organization. So for Frederick Taylor, he shared the macro level focus of Weber in that he was focused on the organization and trying to make the organization as productive, efficient, and effective as possible. The difference between Taylor and Weber is Weber wanted to do it through the structure of the organization, whereas Taylor wanted to do it through work processes, coming up with the one best way to do a job. Now, we see a lot of both Weber and Taylor in our modern day organizations. In your organization, I'm sure you have an organization chart. Probably that organization chart is probably going to reflect pretty much a tall hierarchy. You probably have a supervisor, and perhaps you supervise other employees. So you kind of have that scalar chain. So there's a lot of Weber even in our modern organizations. And there's also a lot of Taylor in scientific management. Because of scientific management, we now have position classification systems in our organizations. So every position will be arrayed on a classification system that will then be used for the purpose of compensation. We have performance evaluation processes whereby we evaluate the performance of employees. We do job analysis. We'll talk more about job analysis in a future week in 2 weeks. But job analysis is where we deconstruct each job into its component elements. Kind of sounds a lot like a time motion study to see what people are doing and how much time they're spending on each one of those tasks. We then take the information from a job analysis and we do what we call job evaluation, where we compare positions to each other for the purpose of then arraying them in this position classification system and then awarding compensation, higher compensation for those more responsible jobs as compared to less responsible jobs. We write job descriptions, position descriptions, and position descriptions will then be used for the purpose of telling people what they are doing on a daily basis and how much time they're spending on each one of those jobs. So all of that is Frederick Taylor and Frederick Taylor's scientific management. So Frederick Taylor's scientific management really has created all these elements, if you will, of modern organizations. And so even though scientific management fell into a lot of disrepute in recent years, scientific management still has a lot of applicability in our modern day organizations. But one of the primary criticisms of scientific management in Frederick Taylor was how dehumanizing it was and how it focused primarily on the organization as opposed to focusing on the well-being of individual employees. Then our third author that we usually cover in our discussion of classic organization theory is Luther Gulick. And Luther Gulick looked at what he called the principal school. And so Luther Gulick in his principal school argued to us that in order to make our organizations effective, we needed to create effective managers. In order to create effective managers, we needed to provide our managers with a toolkit of the tools that they need to effectively manage their organization. So Gulick in his principal school is this acronym POSCORB that we had mentioned last week when we talked about Graham Allison. And Graham Allison told us when we're looking at the similarities between public and private sector organizations, the primary similarity will be in terms of the functions that they do. POSCORB, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. All organizations do those types of functions. But as Allison told us, the primary difference is in how they do those functions. And we do those functions differently in the public sector as compared to how we do them in the private sector. So for Gulick, what he shared with Weber and Taylor is he shared this macro level view, this view of how can we make our organizations more effective and more efficient. So his goal was, again, an organizational goal as opposed to individual employee goals. So that's the similarity between the three. The difference is that Gulick thought that if we could produce a toolkit for our managers, then those managers could, depending on the situation they were facing, reach into that toolkit and pull out maybe strategic planning or pull out their organizing skills or pull out their staffing skills. And they would use the appropriate skill at the appropriate time, given the context of that situation. So Gulick thought if we gave this toolkit of skills to our employees, to our managers, that's how we would then make our organizations effective. So Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at the process of work, Gulick looked at our managers and providing managers with this toolkit in order to make them more effective, and in turn, then making our organizations more effective. But across all three of those authors, the thing that is missing is a focus on individual employees. So for Taylor, for instance, individual employees were just cogs in the machinery of the organization. Gulick paid very little attention to individual employees. Weber barely even mentioned individual employees other than to say that they were professional, expert, and career in nature, but didn't really spend much time talking about how can we help those individual employees achieve what they want to achieve in their careers and what they want to achieve as human beings. So that lack of focus on individual employees is the missing element in the classical school. But before you leave Gulick in the classical school, it's important to mention that here with Luther Gulick, really for the first time, we have what I guess we would consider to be more homegrown theories within the field of public administration. Now, Gulick's training was in generic management, so his training was not in public administration. Remember, ASPA, the American Society for Public Administration, really didn't even start until the 1930s. So his training was very much generic management. But Gulick took a lot of his theories and applied them directly to federal agencies. In the 1930s, as we all know, we had the FDR administration, and FDR, in his response to the Great Depression, he wanted to create his New Deal programs, and the New Deal programs resulted in the creation of all these brand new agencies and all these brand new programs and all these brand new grants and aid. Whenever you create all these agencies, all these different programs, and all these different grants and aid, you are greatly expanding the size and scope of the national government. Once you expand the federal bureaucracy that much, it becomes very difficult for any single president to effectively manage this ever increasing federal bureaucracy. So Gulick was part of this commission known as the Brownlow Commission. And the what happened here? Just lost my screen. The Brownlow Commission, put that in text chat. The Brownlow Commission, if you haven't heard of it before, the Brownlow Commission was a commission created in the 1930s for the express purpose of reorganizing the federal bureaucracy to make it easier to manage for presidents. Some of the things the Brownlow Commission did is the Brownlow Commission was able to, let me put this back in text chat again, Brownlow Commission. It was able to create things such as the Executive Office of the President. And that Executive Office of the President would then be kind of this umbrella agency where all the management agencies in the federal bureaucracy, all those would then be placed within this Executive Office of the Presidency. But in this major reorganization of the federal bureaucracy, Luther Gulick, as a member, a commissioner on this Brownlow Commission, really took the lead and started to apply these principles, this pause corp type of an approach, across the federal bureaucracy. So what we ended up having is we ended up having Luther Gulick actually applying his theories directly into public organizations. So if you're kind of looking for the first homegrown type of public administration theorist, I think you would probably have to argue it would probably be Luther Gulick. So Weber, Taylor, and Gulick are all part of this classical school of organization theory. However, as we said, the one missing element in the classical school was a focus on individual employees and their welfare and their wants, needs, and desires. That was a flaw that was recognized by our neoclassical theorists. And so it gave rise to all these what we call neoclassical schools. So when you are doing scenario number 5 on the midterm, and I ask you for two classical theorists, that would be Weber, Taylor, Gulick, you can pick from them for your two. When I ask you for two neoclassical theorists, it could be anybody from the human relations school, the human resource management school, the systems school, or any of these more modern approaches such as organization and culture that we'll talk about a little bit later on this evening. So those are what we consider neoclassical schools. A neoclassical school is a newer school, newer than the classical school, that was developed as a response to the flaws that were perceived in the classical school. So again, the primary flaw that was seen was the lack of attention paid to individual employees. So let's start with the human relations school and what the human relations theorists believed and how they tried to rectify that flaw in the classical school. So when we start with our discussion of human relations, we usually start with Mary Parker Follett. And there is an article in the classics text by Mary Parker Follett. Follett is one of my favorite authors for a variety of reasons, but one of the primary reasons why I like Follett a lot, and we'll get a lot of Follett when we get to the 660 course as well, is because Follett was one of those authors who was willing to stand up at the time in which scientific management was being accepted across all the private and public sector. So you had all these organizations that were buying into scientific management. Follett was one of the few people willing to stand up and say, wait a second, there are some serious flaws in scientific management. And one of the primary flaws, the lack of paying attention to individual employees. When you look at the time in which Mary Parker Follett was writing, she was writing primarily at the heyday of scientific management. So you look at the 1920s when scientific management was at its peak. That's when Follett was standing up and taking issue with it. So Follett is kind of that lone voice in the wilderness who were speaking up and pointing out these issues with scientific management. Another reason why I like Follett a lot is because she tells us that we should view our organizations in a similar way in which we view a democracy. What she wanted to see is she wanted to see democratic organizations. Democratic organizations that afforded employees the opportunity to participate in their own governance, to self govern and to self determine and to participate in decision making. That is something that was woefully absent in the classical school of organization theory. So Follett says if we're going to think about our organizations as democracies, in a democracy, there are two primary flaws in most democratic systems of government. The first flaw in a democracy is the passivity of its citizens. Democracies tend to create passive citizens. When you think about in our system, we know that there are multiple avenues for people to participate in their own governance. They can participate by voting, they can participate by working for a campaign, they can participate by funding a campaign, they can participate by running for office themselves, they can participate by attending and speaking at city council and school district meetings. They can participate by engaging in political discourse and dialogue with their neighbors and friends and family. There are a lot of different ways to participate in politics. You can write letters to your member of Congress, your member of the state legislature, or your member of city council. Those are all avenues for participation. Most citizens pick the path of least resistance. If you think about individual citizens as being rational, self-interested actors, a rational, self-interested actor is going to pursue the action whereby the benefits are the greatest and the costs are the least. So they kind of do this little informal benefit cost analysis. When you do a benefit cost analysis of all these different avenues of participation, obviously voting is oftentimes the least costly. There are the least resources involved in voting, participating in elections. That's especially true today here in California. Under our relatively new law, voters all get an absentee mail-in ballot, and you can fill out your ballot at home and drop it in the mailbox, or you can drop it off at a drop box. You don't even have to go to the polls in order to vote. And so we've really reduced the cost of participating through voting. And so citizens tend to engage in much more of that passive way. And that's the way in which they usually participate. And that is something that is kind of engendered by a democracy, or at least modern democracies. The second flaw, she says, in a democracy is the creation of particularized interests. And this she is borrowing directly from our good buddy James Madison and Federalist Paper number 10. You've already analyzed Federalist Paper number 10 for a previous Canvas essay, so you're very familiar with it. But as you know, what Madison is telling us is that democracies create factions, factions come into conflict with each other. We cannot eliminate conflict by eliminating factions, and so therefore we try and balance faction against faction. We try and control their effects. But Follett agrees with Madison that democracies will create these particularized interests, these factions, and that they will naturally come into conflict with each other. Democracy creates conflict, and there's really no way you can avoid that conflict. However, according to Follett, in a democratic organization, we need to understand how to deal with that conflict and help resolve that conflict when it does happen. So she says there are three basic ways in which we can resolve conflicts. The first way is domination. One party wins, one party loses. She says that is the worst way to deal with conflict because the party that loses will be disappointed, disaffected, and will probably not want to be a willing implementer of whatever decision was made. So, a better way, but not the best way, obviously, is compromise. In compromise, we have both parties give something up to come to a negotiated settlement. That's better than domination, but we still have both parties giving something up. So there'll be some discontent, if you will, on the part of both parties because they had to give something up to come to this negotiated settlement. She says the most appropriate way to deal with conflict is through what she calls integration. In integration through horizontal and vertical communication, we afford our employees the opportunity to share ideas, share opinions, and participate in their own decision making. When people share ideas and opinions, you end up getting interpenetration of ideas. And so I may have never thought of this idea, but it's something that you mentioned to me. And so now I start thinking about it. Your ideas have interpenetrated into my ideas. That interpenetration then allows for what she calls integration. We can take all those different ideas, we can integrate them, and hopefully synthesize them into a new and different way of dealing with a problem or resolving an issue. So rather it being party A or party B's approach, now it becomes our approach because we have put together this new approach to dealing with the problem. She believes integration can only be achieved through what she calls participatory organizations, democratic organizations that allow opportunities for employees to participate in decision making. Now, you can see that is a stark contrast to the classical theorists who didn't talk about employee participation. Here we've got employee participation in decision making. Now, I think you can certainly make some valid criticisms of Follett in that the more people we have involved in decision making, the slower decision making becomes, the muddier it becomes, and perhaps the less likely it becomes that we are actually going to arrive at a decision. I think that is a good criticism of Follett. I think that sometimes agencies have these time pressures where they just don't have the time to allow everyone to participate in the decision making. But at least if we try and create this democratic aspect to our organizations, we are hopefully getting people more involved in decision making. And the more involved someone is in making a decision, the more likely they are to accept, buy into, and implement that decision in the future. So that's followed her idea of creating democratic organizations. And again, that comes primarily in the 1920s into the 1930s. The problem, obviously, for Mary Parker Follett is that she was a female who was writing at the time where a lot of females were doing writing in this area. So a lot of her male counterparts disregarded her theories or didn't even know about her theories. But a lot of the theories that she is generating with these democratic organizations and her focus on participation, those are the same types of theories that we see generated 10 years and 20 years later by other male human relations theorists. So she was kind of on the cutting edge of this school of human relations theory. Another human relations theorist is Chester Barnard. And now Chester Barnard was again a management type of scholar, very much a lot of the work being done in the private sector. And then we were taking his theories and applying them to public organizations. Barnard's most famous work is The Functions of the Executive. And the argument basically that Barnard made is that in order to be effective as a lead, leaders need to get the compliance on the part of their employees. So, the private sector, you may be able to tell an employee, do this, and they will do it because they're at will employees. They know if they don't do it, they're going to be out of a job. In the public sector, we have career civil servants, and it's much more difficult for us to terminate and discipline those career civil servants. So, you may not be able to tell them, do this, and anticipate that they're going to immediately do it. Instead, to be an effective leader and manager, you need to get the compliance from your employees. You have to get them to comply and provide the contributions to the organization that the organization needs to be effective and efficient. So, what Barnard says is essentially we have a transactional relationship between leaders and their employees. Leaders will provide selective incentives to their employees that will then motivate those employees to then provide the contributions that the leaders need in order to be effective. Those selective incentives may differ depending upon individual employee. Some employees may value certain incentives and not value others. So, for instance, if one of your incentives is that if you get this job done, then we are going to make you employee of the week, and we're going to recognize you as employee of the week. That may matter to some employees, and some other employees don't care one bit about being employee of the week. So you need to know the right set of incentives for each one of your employees so that you can induce them to provide the contributions that the organization needs. And contributions will be the amount of effort they put forth, achieving certain performance and productivity levels. Those are what we consider to be contributions. They may be coming in on a weekend to get a report or a project done. Those are contributions that employees give to the organization. So here's an important thing. With Barnard, now we have to recognize that our individual employees are individual human beings. We have to know what they value and then know what set of incentives to provide to each one of our employees to then get contributions out of them. Also, Barnard argued we need to know our individual employees because each individual employee will have their own set of ethics, their own set of values and expectations. If we ask an employee to take an action or do something that violates their code of ethics, that violates their values, they're probably going to push back very hard on that request. So what he says is we have to operate within our employees what he calls zone of indifference. That every employee will have a different zone of indifference. And that zone of indifference is if you ask them to do something and it doesn't violate their values, that's going to be within that zone of indifference. If you are within an employee's zone of indifference, you are much more likely to get their compliance and their acquiescence as opposed to if you are not in that zone of indifference. So the bottom line for Barnard is he's telling us employees are different. They're not just replaceable cogs in the machinery. We need to understand their differences in order to get the most we can out of them to make our organizations effective and efficient. And then our third human relations theorist is probably someone you have bumped into before in some previous courses at the undergraduate level, and that is this person by the name of Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo starts to bring a little bit more of a psychological type of approach to understanding our organizations. Mayo and his colleagues did a lot of different experiments. And one of the experiments that became most popular, most famous, are the Hawthorne experiments. And the Hawthorne experiments, what Mayo did is he went into this Hawthorne electrical plant. And what he wanted to see is he wanted to see the impact of a change in a physical stimulus on the productivity levels of employees. So he was basically trying to explain employee productivity, explain employee behavior. So they started very simple. They said, let's go in and see the relationship between the level of lighting and employee productivity. So he goes to this electrical plant and he says, okay, let's first start by increasing the lighting level. Let's turn the lights up. And the hypothesis is you turn the lights up, people will become more productive because they're better able to see what they are doing on a daily basis. So he turns up the lights, and sure enough, productivity levels go up. So checks off that hypothesis correct. Then he says, let's reverse that. Let's turn the lighting level down. If we turn down the lighting level, we would assume that productivity levels will go down because people can't see what they're doing. Turn down the lighting levels, and productivity levels continue to go up at even higher levels than they were when the lighting level was high. So it's not that physical stimulus of lighting level that's having an impact upon productivity. It was the social aspect that was having the impact. These researchers were talking to employees, and probably for the first time, these employees were being asked questions such as how happy are you? How satisfied are you? How much you like your job? How much you like your coworkers? They were being asked their opinions on things. They were being given the opportunity to participate in telling these researchers what they felt and what they thought could be done better in that factory. Just by paying attention to those workers, you were increasing their productivity levels. You were motivating them, making them feel better about being working there, and therefore increasing their productivity levels. So Mayo really does focus our attention on organizations as social environments and how important the social aspect of an organization is for enhancing performance and productivity levels. Mayo also found that whenever he put employees into groups, if one member of that group was not pulling their weight, they were not doing a good enough job, they were not working hard enough, the other members of the group would then put pressure on that person to make them work harder to make the rest of the members of the group look good. So he also realized then the importance of groups within our organizations, not just formal groups, but also informal groups. So essentially, what Mayo tells us is that people are social animals and they have these psychological needs. They have these needs to be valued and these needs to belong to something. And those social psychological needs will lead to higher levels of productivity if we pay attention to those needs. So as you see, Mayo, much like Barnard and much like Follett, really starts to focus on the individual employees and the wants, needs, and desires of those individual employees. However, the problem here is that these human relations theorists, Follett and Barnard and Mayo, look primarily at how they could get more productivity out of employees. So if we pay attention to them, if we ask them their opinion, if we allow them to participate in decision making, if we provide them with the incentives that they value, if we do those types of things, we can then extract more contributions from them. We can then extract more productivity levels from them. For what end? For the purpose of helping the organization become more effective and more efficient. So at the end of the day, the overall focus of the human relations theorist is still a focus upon the organization and what is best for the organization. So it's still very much that macro level end goal of what can we get out of employees in order to make the organization more effective. That was a flaw that was recognized by another school of thought known as the Human Resource Management School. And so authors of the Human Resource Management School were troubled with the fact that the human relations theorists were essentially trying to exploit employees to get more contributions from them to benefit the organization. And so because of that perceived flaw, we then have the development of this Human Resource Management School. And that's one of the things that, again, is important in this evolution of these different theories, is that each new school of thought is developed as a response or rejoinder to flaws that were perceived in the preceding school of thought. So human relations school was developed to deal with the flaws they saw in the classical school. Human resource management school developed to try and deal with the flaw in the human relations school that they felt human relations theorists were being too exploitative of the employees within organizations. So the three authors of the Human Resource Management School that we'll talk about here, we'll talk about different ones and more of them when we get to the 660 course. But for our purposes tonight, the authors we look at are Maslow, McGregor, and Argyris. Now, your first one, Abraham Maslow. If you've taken any psychology courses, you are probably familiar with Abraham Maslow and his basic hierarchy of needs. Maslow tells us that each individual has this hierarchy of needs. At the bottom level of this hierarchy of this pyramid, you have what are called physiological needs. So needs such as food, needs such as water, needs such as clothing, needs such as adequate housing. Those are physiological needs that every human body, every human person will need. The problem is that some people find a deficiency in those needs. That deficiency in those needs then serves as a motivator for that individual, and that individual will then be motivated until that deficiency has been rectified. So if you are hungry, you'll be motivated by that hunger until you have enough food to eat and hunger is no longer an issue. Same type of thing with water. And once thirst is quenched, then it no longer serves as an immediate motivator. So physiological needs are what he calls the deficiency needs. Then the next level up, you have what are called safety needs. Everyone has the need to feel safe and secure from harm. Again, if you do not feel safe and secure, you are going to be motivated by trying to feel safe and secure. Next level up, you have the belonging needs. Everyone has the psychological need in order to belong to something, to belong to a family, to belong to a group of friends, to belong to an organization. And so people will then be motivated by a deficiency in their feelings of belongingness. Next level up are your esteem needs. People have the need to feel that they're held in high esteem by other people that they value. So you're held in high esteem by your colleagues and by your peers. Those needs, esteem needs, belonging needs, safety needs, and physiological needs are the deficiency needs, in that people are motivated by a deficiency in those needs. Once that deficiency is then rectified, then that need ceases to be a motivator. At the apex of the pyramid of the hierarchy of needs, you have self-actualization. Self-actualization is a being, or sometimes what he called a growth need. And with self-actualization is essentially becoming all that you can be, achieving your utmost potential as a human being. It is a growth need because we never fully achieve our full potential. It's something we are always striving to do. So the motivator here is not a motivation from a deficiency, but rather is a motivation for growth, to continue growing and to continue trying to become all that you can be. The important thing here is Maslow is saying that everyone has a hierarchy of needs, and it is possible that this hierarchy of needs may be a little different from person to person. So for someone, their most immediate need may be a safety need as opposed to a physiological need. For some people, their need for esteem will be more immediate than their need for belonging. So these needs may be in a different order depending upon the individual. So again, what that means is the same thing that what Barnard told us. We need to know our individual employees and know what types of needs are motivating those individual employees. And then it becomes the job or part of the job of the organization to help these employees fulfill these needs. And especially with self-actualization, it means that the organization needs to provide the opportunities for people to grow, for people to grow as human resources, to develop their skills and their abilities so that they can achieve what they want to achieve in life. That's an important difference from the human relations school. And that here in human resource management, we are saying that it's kind of a two-way street between the employee and the organization. For classical theorists and for human relations theorists, it was what can the employee do for the organization to help the organization achieve its goals? Now, here with Human Resource Management School, is what can the organization do for the employee to help the employee achieve their own individual goals? So it's really incumbent upon the organization to help employees self actualize and to develop as human resources. Then our second author in this school is Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor knew about Abraham Maslow, was a big fan of Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and uses it to then create what he calls his theory X and theory Y. Theory X is an assumption about individual employees that says that individual employees are lazy, they are not very intelligent, they don't like to work. They would rather loaf off and just play as opposed to work. It's a very dim view of human beings. It's kind of like a Frederick Taylor type of view of human beings. Contrast that to theory Y. Theory Y is just the opposite. Theory Y says that individuals are intelligent, they are creative, they are innovative, they enjoy work as much as leisure, they seek out opportunities for more responsibility and more accountability. It's a much more positive view of individual human beings. The problem, according to McGregor, is that the majority of our organizations are theory X organizations, but the majority of our employees are theory Y employees. So we're basically taking theory Y employees and we are shoehorning them into a theory X organization, which means all these needs to grow and to move towards self actualization that these theory Y employees have, all those needs are then being tamped down by this classical theory X organization. So McGregor's argument is we need to take a theory X organization and we have to transform it into a theory Y organization to better meet the needs of our theory Y employees. And he provides a lot of different strategies for this, and we'll cover in 660. But one of the strategies that's most prominent is a strategy known as job enrichment. So McGregor says that organizations can engage in job enrichment, which will then make them more theory Y as compared to theory X in orientation. Job enrichment is when you afford your employees the opportunity to identify different types of skills that they want to develop in the course of their job. So you sit down with employees with their position description and you ask them, where do you want to be in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years from now? So if you sit down with an employee in city government and that person says, I want to be a city manager, well, then the city should then provide that employee with opportunities to develop the skills that they will need to ascend to the position of a city manager. So perhaps you allow them to work in different departments in the city and they can rotate around these different departments. So you kind of get a flavor of what all the different departments do within in the city. Perhaps you allow them the opportunity to start supervising employees so they can build and develop their supervisory skills. That's an example of job enrichment. The important thing about job enrichment is you're just not adding tasks and duties onto their job description, but rather you are allowing them to participate in really fashioning their job description so that it can help them achieve their ultimate goals in the organization as well as beyond the doors of the organization as well. So for McGregor, the obligation for the organization is again to help develop our Theory Y employees as human resources, and developing them as human resources is a valuable goal in and of itself, even if it does not directly contribute to the achievement of organizational goals. So if you provide somebody with the opportunity to develop their skills and then they find a job someplace else and they take their skills to another organization, that's okay. Because what you have done is you've helped them develop as a human resource, and that is a valuable end into itself, irrespective of what it contributes to this particular organization. Chris Ardress, our third human resource management scholar, was a direct student of Douglas McGregor. And McGregor's his background was primarily in generic management. And Ardress also had a background in management, but also looked a lot at the psychological elements of organizations. And Chris Ardress, building upon Douglas McGregor and his theory Y, put together his theory known as personal growth needs. And according to Chris Ardress and personal growth theory, as people go through a maturation process, they change as individuals. So as you go through a maturation process, you develop deepening interests, And so your interests are deeper as opposed to being more superficial in nature. You also start taking into account a much more longer time period type of perspective. So instead of just worrying about today and tomorrow and next week, you start worrying about years down the road. They start to get more involved in their communities and in their organizations as they go through this maturation process. According to Ardress, this maturation process is natural for human beings to go through. It is the job of the organization to help employees work their way through this personal growth process by providing those types of opportunities for them to have the deepening interest and to participate more in their communities and participate more in their organizations. So, at its very heart, the Human Resource Management School says it's not just what the employee can do for the organization, it's what the organization can do for the employee. And that two-way street between employees and organizations, that's the primary difference between the Human Resource Management School and the School of Human Relations. But one characteristic that is true for the classical school, the human relations school, as well as the human resource management school, is that they all took an internal focus and that they were looking within the walls of the organization. So he studied organizations by looking at what went on within the walls of the organization. We didn't think a whole lot about the relationship between the organization and its external environment. Today, we know that for an organization to survive and be successful, that organization needs to have an environment that is capable and willing to support that organization, to provide that organization with the resources the organization needs in order to survive. If you have an external environment where there's not enough support for what you're doing as an organization, or you have elected officials who simply don't want to provide you with the appropriations that you need, that agency is probably going to go out of business relatively quickly. So the next school is the School of Systems Theory. The Systems School recognized that all these previous schools looked so much internally to the organization, they didn't take a look outside the walls of the organization. So in systems theory, we start looking at the organization and its surrounding environment. There are two different types of systems theory. There's closed or natural systems theory, and then there's open systems theory. In closed or natural open systems theory, we kind of look at organizations as living organisms, kind of like John Gauss, who I introduced you to a couple of weeks ago. John Gauss, in his Ecology of Public Administration, remember, says that we think about organizations as living organisms, and we have to try and explain how they develop and how they grow. Sometimes how they grow and develop will be a result of what's going on internally to the organization. Sometimes it's a result of some of the forces that are feeling from their outside environment. But when you look at organizations from this natural perspective as living organisms, you understand that organizations, just like living organisms, go through a life cycle. And so, just like with a living organism, it is born, it ages, and then it goes out of existence. You assume the same thing will probably happen to an organization. So, with a living organism, and I won't depress you too much here on Wednesday evening, but as a living organism, all living organisms, from the moment that they are born, they start to dissipate energy into their environment. They start the decaying process, and eventually they will no longer have the resources necessary and the energies necessary to continue to survive. And that's when they then die and go out of existence. Well, the argument here is organizations go through that same type of process. This is what's known as the entropy process, the process of dissipating energy into your environment until there's not enough energy to then support continued existence. That's a process known as entropy. Organizations, in order to survive in the natural systems approach, they need to try and find a balance point known as the point of homeostasis. And the point of homeostasis is the balance point within the organization known as organizational health. So if you look at a living organism, you look at a person, their balance, their homeostasis is the point at which their blood pressure is normal. Their oxygen saturation rate is normal. They are devoid of diseases. That's what you would consider the point of homeostasis. They are in a steady state. They are in a balance internally within that individual. Well, it's the same type of thing with organizations. Organizational harmony, when all the different parts of the organization are working together to achieve the same goals and objectives, that's the point at which you have this point of homeostasis. And that's the goal of organizations. The longer they can maintain this homeostasis, the longer organizations will then survive into the future. Then the other approach to systems theory is open systems theory. In open systems theory, we really start looking beyond the walls of the organization and we look at how the organization is interacting with its external environment. So this is this two-way street. We're asking the question of how does the organization affect the environment? How does the environment affect the organization? So there are a lot of resources that the external environment can provide to the organization to help the organization enhance its chances of agency survival. Open systems theorists introduce us to this idea known as negative entropy. That yes, as organizations age, they will lose resources into their environment. Yes, they will lose maybe some appropriations. They may lose some political support. They will lose employees through either resignations or retirement. Those are all energies that they're dissipating out into their environment. But it's a two-way street in that those organizations can then also import new energies and new resources into the organization to offset those energies that they lost. That's what's known as negative entropy. All organizations, even an open system, are still trying to find this point of homeostasis. The difference is in open systems theory, that point of homeostasis is the balance between the organization and its external environment. That point of homeostasis can be achieved in a variety of different ways. And that's your next 25-cent word of the night, which is equifinality. Equifinality says that there are multiple paths toward homeostasis. There are multiple paths toward finding this steady state, finding this balance between the organization and its external environment. So there is no one size fits all approach. That's an extremely important point because as we continue to go through this evolution of the organization theories, what we will see is that we continue to move away from the one size fits all approach. For the classical school, the one size fits all approach was if you have the right structure, according to Weber, or the one best way to do the job, according to Taylor, or the right toolkit in terms of the right principles to make your leaders effective. That's a one size fits all type of an approach. Even to a degree, the human relations and human resource management theorists were kind of telling us this is the way in which you manage your employees in order to either be effective as an organization or to help those employees achieve what they want to achieve as human beings. Now we're starting to move more away from that. And now we're saying, well, there are multiple paths for organizations to achieve homeostasis. There are multiple paths for organizations to come into proper balance with their environments and then survive into the future. So one of the major trends we've seen in this evolution is the eventual death of the one size fits all approach, the recognition that understanding public organizations is much more nuanced and much more contextual in nature, in that we have to take into account the context of the situation when we study our public organizations. And speaking of that, in the few minutes that we have left, the one modern theory that I like to highlight in this class is the theory of organization culture. Now, in 660, we'll talk about a lot of other modern theories. We'll get into leadership theories. We'll talk about quality management. We'll talk about a whole bunch of more modern theories. But for our limited purposes here, the one we're going to focus on is organization culture. Now, systems theory was 60s and 70s and 80s. Organization culture is primarily post 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. One of the primary authors in the organization culture school of thought is this person by the name of Edgar Schein. And Edgar Schein develops this theory of organization culture in that he argues every organization has its own different, unique culture. And I think we all understand what a culture is. We talked a little bit about culture when we talked about the Woodrow Wilson article. A culture is a shared set of values, a shared set of norms, a shared set of expectations for how we behave in society and how we interact and engage with others in society. So it's kind of these shared types of beliefs. That's a culture. Sheen says every organization has its own set of shared beliefs, its own organization culture. What that means is that we can no longer take a one size fits all approach and apply it to every single public organization. In order to understand what we need to do in terms of studying our organization, we need to understand the specifics of that organization culture. So you can study organization culture in a similar way as to you study something like an ancient society. So if you want to study the culture of an ancient society, you would go on an archaeological dig. You would dig up these artifacts. So you would dig up things such as eating utensils. You might dig up wall paintings, things such as that. Those artifacts are tangible indicators of how that society acted and behaved on a daily basis. Those are tangible artifacts. Organizations create artifacts as well. But organization artifacts are things such as the agendas for meetings, the minutes from meetings that were held, the policy and procedure manuals, the rules and regulations. Those are all the tangible artifacts that will give us some insight into how that organization operates on a daily basis. You look at the agenda for a meeting, you'll see here are the important topics at that given time for that organization. You look at the minutes, this is how they addressed those topics, and these are the types of things and actions that they took. So those artifacts are very important for understanding organization culture. They're also relatively superficial in that they are very easy to find and they're very easy to study. Then at a little deeper level to organization culture, you also have these things called espoused values. An espoused value will be something like a mission statement or a vision statement, where we say, this is who we are as an organization, this is who we want to be as an organization. I think in the first night of class, I introduced you to the public sector values that underpin this MPA program. So we have articulated our values for this program as well. Those are espoused values because we are telling the world this is what we value as an organization. At the deepest level of culture are these things called basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are assumptions that we all share as members of the organization about how we should behave, about how we should interact and engage with others in the organization, how we should interact with and engage with people outside the organization. Oftentimes, these basic assumptions are unspoken. It's just an assumption that we all share as an organization. We don't talk about it a lot. We don't really share those a lot with the rest of the world. So these basic assumptions are oftentimes much more difficult to study in organization culture. You're probably going to have to sit down with individual members of that organization to try and get at these basic assumptions. But every organization has its own unique culture that can be studied through looking at artifacts, espoused values, and basic assumptions. Leaders can also embed cultures directly into their organizations. So a new leader comes into an organization and they may be able to embed the culture that they want into that organization. And there are a series of primary and secondary embedding mechanisms that leaders can use. We won't get into them here tonight in this class. We will get into them then when we get to PPA 660, but things such as slogans. And so if you've ever lived through a new leader coming into your organization, they may bring with them a slogan. And that slogan then ends up appearing on all the organization's stationery and appears in all the meetings. And it really starts to become embedded in the thinking of that organization. What leaders value, what leaders reward versus what leaders punish, that's also an embedding mechanism. And so if you see that people are being rewarded for a behavior, obviously that's something that is valued by the organization. If people are being penalized for a type of behavior, obviously it's something that we don't want to see within the organization. But again, the important thing about organization culture and why it's the one modern theory I picked for us to look at tonight is because it really does underscore how far we have come in organization theory. Now we realize there is no one size fits all approach. Now we have to study organizations according to their individual cultures. What that means is that the study of public organizations has become much more complex in recent years. It's more difficult to study organizations. It would be really simple and really great if we say, here's one theory, we apply it to everybody, and the whole world is happy. We know it doesn't work that way. So we have to take a much more nuanced, much more specific approach in studying public organizations. But I think it is by far a much more appropriate way in which we study our public organizations. So, in a very large nutshell, in about an hour and 25 minutes, that is an overview of the development of literature in organization theory, the different theoretical perspectives that have been developed over about 150 years in the field of public administration. How to use this information now obviously will help you on scenario 5 on the midterm assignment or assessment. But the other way in which you're going to use this information is in terms of if public administration is a separate academic discipline. So if it is a separate academic discipline, these are going to be relatively unique theories that are based upon unique methods that are used to study unique phenomena. So as you think about that question of public administration as a discipline, think about it from the perspective of uniqueness. How unique are our theories? How unique are our methods? How unique are our phenomena? The more unique they are, the more likely public administration is an academic discipline. The less unique they are, the more likely it is public administration is a subfield in a larger discipline such as political science. So I hope this information has been helpful for kind of informing not just organization theory in that scenario, but also that Canvas essay number 4 that you will be doing in terms of public administration as a discipline. Again, there is no right or wrong answer. If you say it's an academic discipline, if you justify it well enough, then that's great. If you say it's a subfield and you justify the answer well enough, then that's great as well. Again, gets back to my favorite answer to everything, which is it depends. Okay, I hate to dump all this information on you and then run, but I really do have to leave by 7:30 if I'm going to catch that flight and get to DC on time and not sit in LAX all night long. So we'll cut it there for now. This recording I will probably not be able to get up on our website by tomorrow morning because I'll obviously flying cross country, but I'm hoping then by tomorrow, sometime in the evening, I'll be able to get it posted up onto our Canvas site. Then in preparation for our class next week, which again will begin at 7 p.m., we will start off talking about the final assessment. I'll walk you through those 5 scenarios. Then we'll get into the last major topic of this course, which is the functions of public administration. We'll talk about the role of public administrators in public policy, the role of public administrators in the implementation and evaluation of public programs, and what we mean by effectiveness in public administration. Because after all these theories, all these reforms, everything that we do in studying public organizations is primarily done for the purpose of making those organizations more effective. So it's central to our discussion to really understand what we mean by effectiveness. I'll introduce you to 4 different models of organizational effectiveness. We'll talk about what they are, their similarities and differences, and how they work. Okay?
Dr. Powell, good question.
Sure.
You mentioned Gaulick, Taylor, and I couldn't understand if it was Faber or Weber.
Weber, it's the same. It's pronounced Weber. It's pronounced Weber. It's spelled Weber, but it's German, so it's pronounced Weber. Yes.
Got it. It's the German Max. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's Weber. It looks like Weber, but it's Weber.
Got it. Thank you very much. That was it. Good. Have a good and safe flight.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and I will talk to you next Wednesday. So take care. Thanks.